Arlen Vex always said the only thing worse than an uninvited guest was an uninvited guest from another timeline. Of course, he said that, while nursing a glass of something strong enough to strip paint, staring at a hologram of the latest anomaly outside the city. The sprawling lunar city of Umbra Nexus wasn't supposed to have problems. Not those kinds, anyway. Sure, there were the usual issues: corruption, smuggling, the occasional bar brawl, things a city councilor could drink to. But time rifts, that was a buzzkill. The council chamber was dimly lit and smelled faintly of burnt toast, a side effect of running on miniature black holes, or so the engineers claimed. Arlen wasn't convinced. He suspected it had more to do with Councillor Jorvik's breakfast habits. "All right, folks," Arlen said, leaning back in his squeaky chair, the sound like a rat being strangled. "We've got ourselves a temporal conundrum." As if dealing with the bureaucratic time suck was bad enough, Jorvik, a man who could sweat in a snowstorm, wiped his forehead. "So these ancient warriors, you're telling me they just popped out of nowhere like a bad rash?" Arlen confirmed. "Reports say they're camped out on the outskirts, brandishing swords and shields, and demanding to know who the hell took their horses." Councillor Brina, whose cynicism was only matched by her ability to drink anyone under the table, snorted. "Tell them we traded their ponies for a decent Wi-Fi signal." Arlen chuckled. "I'd like to see their faces when they learn we ride around in metal boxes instead of on horseback." Might just be enough to blow their primitive minds. The council wasn't entirely sure if the sudden appearance of warriors was a threat or just an elaborate prank. Arlen, however, wasn't taking chances. "We need to figure out what this rift is and shut it down before we're up to our necks in more confused swordsmen." Brina sighed. "Guess we're calling in the science team." "Again, unless you fancy explaining quantum physics to a guy in chainmail," Arlen replied dryly. Jorvik shifted in his seat, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'll coordinate with the science division. At least they're used to cleaning up after our messes." The meeting dragged on, filled with the usual squabbling over budgets and who would have to brave the outskirts to deal with the newcomers. Arlen watched the hologram flicker, displaying images of rugged men and women, their expressions a mix of befuddlement and belligerence. At least some things were universal. Eventually, the council adjourned, leaving Arlen to his thoughts and the remains of his drink. He peered out the window at the sprawling city. Umbra Nexus was a marvel of human ingenuity, powered by the impossible. But nothing was too impossible for humans to mess up. Later that night, Arlen found himself outside the city borders, accompanied by a small team of scientists and security personnel. It was the kind of cold that got into your bones and set up camp. Umbra's moon-based charm, complete with all the hospitality of a broken airlock. "Keep close," Arlen instructed his team, not that they needed reminding. Being alone in the dark was for fools or heroes, and he wasn't sure he wanted to be either. They approached the camp cautiously. Fires flickered in the distance, casting jittery shadows of the ancient warriors who were too busy arguing to notice their visitors. Arlen stepped forward, trying to look more authoritative than he felt. "Greetings," he called, aware of how ridiculous he sounded. "Can we have a word?" One of the warriors, a giant of a man with a beard that looked like it could house small wildlife, turned. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Who are you?" "Just a humble city councilor," Arlen replied, which was true enough. "And you are Bjorn," the warrior grunted. "Where is my horse?" About that." Arlen hesitated. "What if I told you that you've traveled through time and, well, horses are a bit out of style now?" Bjorn's face did something complicated. "Time travel, is this sorcery, more like a cosmic oopsie?" Arlen said, shrugging. "We're working on fixing it." Bjorn looked back at his camp where his companions were starting to take notice. "We fight," Bjorn declared, raising his sword. "Whoa, whoa," Arlen held up his hands. "No fighting necessary. How about a hot meal and a place to rest while we sort this out?" Bjorn considered this, finally lowering his weapon. "Very well, but if you lie, I will cleave you." "Fair enough." Arlen turned to his team. "Get them into the city, show them some hospitality." Maybe they'll appreciate a warm bed. The scientists exchanged looks, but began to usher the warriors towards Umbra Nexus, careful to avoid any sudden moves that might get them skewered. As the group trudged back, Arlen fell into step beside Brina. "Think they'll realize we're making this up as we go?" she asked. "Maybe," Arlen said. "But with any luck, they'll be too distracted by the novelty of indoor plumbing." Brina chuckled. "Here's hoping." "So what's next? More meetings, more headaches. And hopefully someone smarter than us figures out how to shut that rift before something worse shows up." "Like what?" "Whatever's nastier than people with swords, I suppose." Brina nodded. "Guess we'll cross that bridge when we're being chased across it." "Exactly," Arlen said, not entirely joking. He watched the warriors as they entered the city, their awe at the lights and technology a temporary distraction from their predicament. Once they were settled, Arlen headed back to his office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a gravity well. He poured another drink, staring at the hologram of the rift, still open and ominous. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than warriors from the past. As he settled into his creaky chair, he muttered to no one in particular, "Here's hoping tomorrow's just another day in the life of a city councilor." But he knew better. Tomorrow would bring its own unique brand of chaos, and he'd be there, glass in hand, ready to face it with the same grim determination as always. The screen on his desk flickered to life, a message from the science team blinking insistently. Arlen sighed, reaching for the display. If the universe wanted to throw more curveballs, he'd be damned if he wasn't going to hit them right back. With any luck, they'd get this mess sorted out before more surprises popped through the time rift, looking for horses and someone to blame. But knowing his luck, probably not. And that was just another day in Umbra Nexus, where the past was a real pain in the ass. Arlen Vex had seen a lot in his time as a counselor in Umbra Nexus, but an army of time-displaced warriors marching down Main Street was new even for him. He stood at the edge of the council chamber, gripped a cup of what was optimistically called coffee, and watched the chaos unfold on the monitors. "Is it just me, or does anyone else think it's a miracle we haven't all been skewered yet?" Arlen asked no one in particular. Brina, leaning against the wall with a flask that probably didn't contain water, smirked. "Give it time. I bet half of them haven't even figured out what a gun is." Jorvik, looking as though he had just run a marathon, wiped sweat from his brow. "I think the ones with axes might figure it out quicker than we'd like." The council chamber was a whirlwind of activity, a clamor of voices and the incessant beeping of alerts. Arlen's eyes drifted to the hologram of the time rift, now flickering with increased intensity. More warriors had already stepped through, some looking more bewildered than belligerent. "Well, at least they haven't figured out which end of the sword to point at us yet," Arlen muttered, glaring at the rift as though it had personally insulted him. "Should we even be surprised?" Brina asked, taking a sip from her flask. "We've been tempting fate for years." "Something's bound to go wrong when you're messing with black holes." "I'd argue we've been tempting fate ever since we decided living on a rock with no atmosphere was a good idea," Arlen replied. Jorvik, trying to catch his breath, looked up. "What about Dr. Etha? He's supposed to be the expert on whatever this is." Arlen considered it. Dr. Quillen Etha was the city's resident genius/madman, a physicist with more degrees than social skills. If anyone could make sense of the time rift, it was him. And if he couldn't, well, they were already knee-deep in trouble. "Fine," Arlen said, setting down his cup with a definitive clunk. "Let's see what Quillen has to say. Maybe he's got some spark of brilliance left to share with us." Brina chuckled. "Or at least a good bottle of something stronger than this swill," she said, holding up her flask. The three counselors made their way through the corridors of Umbra Nexus, avoiding the larger crowds of warriors gathered in confused clusters. The city, usually a model of organized chaos, was now descending into outright pandemonium. Arlen couldn't help but grimace at the sight of a Norseman trying to figure out how a vending machine worked. Bet he thinks it's some kind of sorcery, Jorvik commented, noticing Arlen's gaze. Most likely, Arlen replied, though he might just think it's possessed. They reached the door to Dr. Etha's lab, marked with a sign that read, "Enter at your own risk." Arlen knocked, though he doubted the gesture was necessary given the cacophony within. A moment later, the door slid open to reveal a disheveled man with wild hair and glasses perched precariously on his nose. "Ah, Counselor Vex," Dr. Etha greeted, his voice a mix of excitement and mild paranoia. "What brings you to my humble abode of scientific discovery?" "Time rifts," Arlen said bluntly, "and their tendency to invite uninvited guests wielding pointy objects." Quillen blinked, then smiled. "Ah, the rift, fascinating, isn't it? A genuine anomaly right here on our doorstep. Of course, it does seem to be causing quite a bit of inconvenience." "Inconvenience is one way to put it," Brina said dryly. "We're just hoping you can shed some light on why our city is turning into a historical reenactment society." Quillen gestured for them to enter, the lab a chaotic mess of gadgets, notes, and half-eaten meals. "I've been studying the rift since it first appeared," he explained. "Its energy signatures are unlike anything I've seen before. It's as if the very fabric of space-time is unraveling, acting as a bridge between periods long separated by history." Arlen crossed his arms, peering at the multitude of screens displaying data he couldn't begin to understand. "And how do we stop it? Before someone decides to set up a medieval kingdom in the middle of our city?" Quillen rubbed his chin, pondering. "Well, closing the rift is tricky. It requires a delicate balance of energy manipulation, perhaps even reverting the polarity of the miniature black holes we use for power," Jorvik groaned. "And here I thought we were done with rewiring those things." "Not to worry," Quillen said, waving a hand dismissively. "I've devised a plan. It's just rather theoretical at the moment." Arlen sighed, feeling the weight of the situation like a hangover that wouldn't quit. "Theoretical, Doctor, we don't have the luxury of theory. We need something definitive before more history decides to join the party." Quillen nodded, focusing his scattered thoughts. "I assure you, Counselor, I'm doing everything I can. With a bit more time and the right resources, I believe I can stabilize the rift." Brina snorted. "Resources? You mean the entire city's blind faith in your genius, right?" "That," Quillen admitted with a grin, "and maybe a few volunteers to assist with some hands-on experiments, purely scientific, of course." Arlen exchanged a glance with Jorvik and Brina. It was a gamble, trusting Quillen with something so critical, but they didn't have much choice. The alternative was a city overrun with warriors from every era imaginable, each with their own agenda and none of them friendly. "All right," Arlen said finally. "You've got our support. Just make sure your experiments don't blow us all to kingdom come. We're rather fond of existing." Quillen's expression was a mix of relief and excitement. "Thank you, Counselor. I promise I'll do my utmost to keep calamity to a minimum." "Minimum's about all we can hope for," Brina quipped. "Well, that and a stiff drink." As they left the lab, Arlen pondered the enormity of their situation. They were dealing with forces beyond their control, trying to manage a crisis that defied logic. But that was life in Umbra Nexus. Chaos and calamity were just part of the deal. The trio headed back to the council chamber, passing more bewildered warriors. Some had started to adapt, trading their swords for the more practical tools of modern life. One particularly enterprising Roman was already haggling over a hover bike. "At least they learn quickly," Jorvik observed. "Too quickly," Arlen replied. "We might have to start charging tuition." Back in the council chamber, Arlen poured himself another drink. The hologram of the rift continued to flicker ominously, a constant reminder of their precarious position. "Here's to surviving another day," Brina said, raising her flask in a mock toast. "Surviving," Arlen echoed, clinking his glass against hers. "And maybe, just maybe, figuring out how to fix this damn mess." As night fell over Umbra Nexus, Arlen sat alone in his office, staring at the city beyond. The warriors had been settled as best they could be, though their presence was still like an itch that couldn't be scratched. He knew the coming days would bring more challenges, more headaches, and perhaps even more time-displaced visitors. But for now they had a plan, a fragile hope that Dr. Etha's genius would pull them through. And if not, at least they'd go down swinging, armed with sarcasm, wit, and the occasional stiff drink. Just another day in paradise, Arlen muttered to himself, the weight of the situation momentarily forgotten as he drained his glass. In the distance, the rift shimmered, a silent promise of the chaos yet to come. But Arlen wasn't worried. He'd learned long ago that the only way to face chaos was head-on, with a smirk and a cynical laugh. And maybe, just maybe, they'd come out the other side with something resembling victory, or at least a good story to tell at the bar. As he settled into his chair, Arlen let out a weary sigh, ready to tackle whatever madness tomorrow would bring. In Umbra Nexus, the past was never truly gone. It just had a bad habit of showing up unannounced, demanding answers and explanations that no one really had. "Here's to tomorrow," he murmured, closing his eyes. "Whatever it decides to throw at us." Arlen Vex leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering hologram of the time rift as if sheer willpower could make it close. The council chamber buzzed with the sounds of chaos, both real and electronic. Alerts beeped incessantly, reminding him that everything was on the verge of going terribly wrong again. "Feels like we're running a daycare for homicidal history buffs," he muttered, though no one seemed to hear him over the din. Brina, never far from her trusty flask, leaned in. "What's the plan, fearless leader?" Besides hoping the rift packs its things and leaves like a bad tenant, Jorvik, who'd somehow found a second wind, or maybe it was just adrenaline, cleared his throat. "We need to get them talking. Right now it's one misunderstanding away from Gladiator vs. Viking cage matches in the streets. Wouldn't be a fair fight," Brina quipped. "No one beats a Viking in a drinking contest either." Arlen rubbed his temples. "All right, let's corral Dr. Etha again. If anyone can cook up a way to bridge the gap with these time-tossed warriors, it's him, preferably without turning the city into a crater." The trio made their way back to Dr. Etha's lab, sidestepping a spat between a centurion and a samurai over who had the better metalwork. Brina rolled her eyes. If only they put that passion into figuring out plumbing. The lab door opened with a familiar hiss, revealing Dr. Etha, eyes wide and hair somehow even more disarrayed than before. "Back so soon? To what do I owe the pleasure of your impending nervous breakdowns?" Arlen waved him off. "We need a way to communicate with our guests before they decide to reenact the Battle of Thermopylae in downtown Umbra Nexus." "Ah, cross-cultural dialogue," Quillen mused. "A real challenge when everyone thinks everyone else is a demon or a god. Or both," Brina added, taking a swig. Quillen nodded, gesturing to a cluttered workbench. "I've been tweaking the neural translators from the old diplomatic missions. We could use them to translate their languages in real time. Of course, there's a small chance of brain fry, but that's all part of the adventure, right?" "Brain fry," Jorvik repeated, his voice rising slightly. "As in, oops, there goes your higher cognitive function." "Only if you set the dial too high," Quillen assured him with a grin. "I promise to keep the voltage low." "We wouldn't want any historical figures running around with more than their usual brain damage," Arlen sighed. "And how do we pay for this little experiment? I assume you won't accept IOU from bygone empires." Quillen shrugged. "I've got surplus parts, and what I don't have, I can improvise. It'll work about as well as our current plan of do nothing." "Then let's start fitting these translators," Arlen said, glancing at his companions. "If they can save us from an interior fistfight, they are worth the risk." Dr. Etha handed them a set of translator headbands that looked like a cross between a crown and a torture device. Brina examined her skeptically. "I feel like I'm about to join a bizarre cult." "Think of it more like joining a slightly more bizarre diplomatic corps," Quillen replied, adjusting his glasses. "And remember, if you start smelling burnt toast, take it off. That's always the first sign something's gone wrong." "Great," Jorvik said, deadpan. Because the smell of burnt toast isn't already a constant reminder of our life choices. After a crash course in how not to fry your synapses, the group ventured back into the city's crowded streets, where factions were forming faster than you could say anachronism. Romans, Vikings, samurai, and more, each huddling with their own, plotting who knew what. Arlen approached a Viking warrior who looked like he'd bench-pressed fjords for fun. The man's axe was slung across his back like a sleeping pet. Arlen cleared his throat. Hello there." The Viking blinked at him, expression somewhere between confusion and disdain. Arlen slipped the translator onto his head, adjusting it until the light blinked green. He held his breath. "Can you understand me?" The Viking's eyes widened. "Aye, though your tongue is strange. What sorcery is this?" "Sorcery. We call it science," Arlen replied, trying to sound authoritative rather than terrified. "Look, we need to talk, like, really talk, so we don't all end up regretting this weird time travel meetup." The Viking nodded, eyeing Arlen with newfound respect, or at least less homicidal intent. "A wise chieftain speaks with his enemies before battle." "Let's aim for no battle," Arlen said, glancing at his companions. "One down, 100 to go." Brina was engaging a Roman centurion who seemed more interested in the translator's shiny surface than in conversation. She nudged him. "Focus, buddy. We're trying to prevent a calamity, not start a fashion trend." Jorvik, meanwhile, was attempting to explain the concept of timeout to a samurai who seemed to think it was a form of dishonor on par with cowardice. "No, it's not punishment," Jorvik insisted. "It's like strategic retreat." Slowly, surely, the warriors began to communicate, each one reacting with varying degrees of skepticism and awe. The city, for a moment, felt less like a powder keg and more like a bizarre, anachronistic United Nations meeting. Arlen regrouped with Brina and Jorvik, who were both wearing the weary expressions of babysitters handling particularly unruly charges. "How's it going?" Arlen asked. "Well, the centurion thinks I'm a witch," Brina said brightly. "But at least he listens. The samurai still insists on calling me dishonorable dog, but he's listening too," Jorvik added, shrugging. "It's a start," Arlen said, feeling a flicker of hope. "If we can keep the peace long enough, maybe we can figure out how to send them back. Or at least find them a hobby that doesn't involve cleaving things," Brina suggested. As the day wore on, the factions began to mingle, albeit with the caution of cats in a room full of rocking chairs. Warriors compared weapons, shared stories, and even exchanged the occasional wary grin. Arlen watched the bizarre spectacle unfold with a mix of relief and apprehension. It was working, at least for now. But just as he was beginning to feel optimistic, a commotion drew his attention to the far side of the square. A group of warriors, Norsemen by the look of their beards and furs, had gathered around a modern entertainment device, mistaking it for some kind of newfangled oracle. The screen played an old action film, and the warriors stood transfixed as if witnessing divine revelation. "Guess they're big fans of cinema," Brina said, sidling up to Arlen. "Or maybe they just like watching things explode." "Can't say I blame them," Arlen replied. Explosions are universal, but the spectacle had an unintended side effect. As more warriors gathered, tensions flared anew, cultural misunderstandings bubbling to the surface. Some Romans took offense at the depiction of their ancestors, while a group of Mongols seemed to find the whole affair an affront to their honor. Arlen stepped forward, the weight of 100 potential conflicts pressing down on him. "All right, folks, let's not get carried away. It's just a distraction, not a declaration of war." The warriors turned to him, and for a heartbeat, Arlen thought he might have to run for it. But then slowly they began to back down, the promise of violence diffused by his words, or maybe just by their own exhaustion. "Keep them talking," Jorvik said, appearing at Arlen's side. "As long as they're talking, they're not fighting." "Talking's a start," Arlen agreed. "But we need to figure out what's next. These translators are a band-aid, not a cure, Doctor." Etha arrived, looking pleased as Punch with himself. "I see the neural translators are working. Excellent. Now we just need to work on getting the rift under control. How's that coming along? Brina asked, arching an eyebrow. Quillen shrugged. Well, I haven't blown anything up yet, so that's progress. Arlen shook his head with a tired smile. At this point, I'll take whatever progress we can get, as long as there are fewer explosions. As night descended upon Umbra Nexus, the city settled into a tentative peace. Warriors from across history sat together, their differences momentarily set aside as they watched the stars, constellations that none of them recognized, yet all found strangely comforting. Arlen stood at the edge of the square, watching the scene unfold with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. We've managed to avoid disaster, he said quietly to Brina and Jorvik, who flanked him like sentinels. For now, Brina replied, ever the realist. But what happens tomorrow? Same as every day, Arlen said with a shrug. We keep trying not to get skewered, and maybe, just maybe, we keep this crazy city from tearing itself apart. Hope springs eternal, Jorvik said with a wry grin. Or maybe it's just the booze, Brina added, raising her flask in a mock toast. Arlen chuckled, shaking his head. Whatever gets us through the night. As the stars blinked overhead, Umbra Nexus seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The rift remained a threat, a challenge yet to be solved. But for now, Arlen and his ragtag band of counselors had managed to hold chaos at bay, if only for a little while longer. And that in this unpredictable, impossible city was no small victory. The Umbra Nexus Council chamber, still reeking of burnt toast, was now also echoing with frantic discussions and the occasional curse. Arlen Vex had a headache the size of a small planet, but that was par for the course these days. The time rift was still a gaping wound in the fabric of reality, and now, just when things were starting to calm down, chaos had returned with a vengeance. Arlen, we have a problem, Jorvik said, bursting in like a whirlwind. His renewed energy was both a blessing and a curse. Hrothgar the Unyielding and his merry band of Norse nutcases have decided the city is an affront to the natural order. They've started tearing up the place, and I'm not talking about minor vandalism. Arlen groaned, rubbing his temples. Wonderful. Just when I thought we were done with Viking-era urban renewal. Dr. Etha, who was present for the meeting, adjusted his glasses with a frown. Hrothgar's been less than receptive to the translators. Apparently, even modern technology can't bridge the gap between his skull and reason. Brina snorted, taking a swig from her ever-present flask. Why would he listen to us? We're just the unwashed masses from the future, trying to ruin his fun. Any chance of convincing him to see reason? Arlen asked, not really expecting a positive answer. About as much chance as teaching a cat to tap dance, Brina replied dryly. He's convinced that this rift is a sign from his gods, Arlen sighed. And he's not wrong in a way. It's just not the sign he thinks it is. Well, he's got enough followers to make it a problem, Jorvik said, crossing his arms. They've already started sabotaging parts of the city. Infrastructure's taking a hit, power grids, water supplies, you name it. As if on cue, the lights in the council chamber flickered ominously, a reminder of the chaos outside. Arlen groaned inwardly. So what do? Evict them. Send them back to their own time. Offer them a job in demolition. Dr. Etha cleared his throat. I've been working on a potential solution to stabilize the time rift. It might also help send them back where they belong, but we're talking about rerouting energy from the black holes. There's a non-zero chance it could lead to complications. Jorvik raised an eyebrow. Complications like what exactly? Well, let me put it this way, Dr. Etha said, his grin unsettlingly cheerful. If it works, they go home. If it doesn't, we might find ourselves inside out. Or worse. Inside out sounds unpleasant, Brina observed. Worst house party ever. We can't ignore Hrothgar, though, Arlen interjected. If we don't act, the city's going to collapse on itself before we even have a chance to try Dr. Etha's plan. Maybe we could negotiate, Brina suggested, though she didn't sound overly optimistic about the prospect. Convince him that we can send him and his warriors home if he cooperates. And if he says no, Jorvik asked. Then we show him what the modern world does best: create chaos, Arlen replied, his voice hardening. We can't let them tear the city down around us. With a plan of sorts in mind, Arlen led the group out of the council chamber, hoping that Hrothgar was in a mood for a chat and not a beheading. The streets were alive with the sound of clashing metal and shouted old-world curses, as if they'd walked into an anachronistic brawl. They found Hrothgar near the edge of the city's main square, his warriors gathered around him like moths to a particularly menacing flame. He stood like a statue, immovable and resolute, an axe at his side that looked more than capable of cleaving through just about anything or anyone that got in his way. Arlen approached with as much confidence as he could muster. Hrothgar, a word. The Viking leader turned his gaze on Arlen, eyes cold and calculating. Speak, interloper. Brina gave Arlen a nudge. You're doing great, she whispered sarcastically. Swallowing his nerves, Arlen met Hrothgar's gaze. We need to talk about what's happening here. This city can't withstand the damage your warriors are causing, and neither can you. If we work together, we might be able to send you back to your time. Hrothgar's expression was one of skepticism. Back to my time. And why should I trust you, a man of strange words and stranger devices? Arlen gestured to the chaos around them. Because if this place falls apart, none of us will have a time to call our own. You and your people can return to your lives, your battles. You want glory, right? There's none to be found in destroying a city that means nothing to you. The Viking leader considered this, his warriors watching him closely, awaiting his decision. The silence stretched out, tense and thick as a hangman's noose. Finally, Hrothgar spoke. If you speak true, then I will heed your words, he said. But if you deceive me, I will see this city burn. Arlen nodded, relief washing over him. Agreed. We have a plan, thanks to Dr. Etha. We'll stabilize the rift and return you to your time. Brina, sensing the shift in mood, stepped forward with a conciliatory smile. And in the meantime, maybe we can show you a bit more of what the modern world has to offer. We've got better food than what you're used to, at least. Hrothgar's stern expression cracked, just a little, into what might have been a smile. Very well. Show me your world and I will show you mine. The impromptu truce was tenuous at best, but it was a step in the right direction, assuming Arlen and his team could deliver on their promises. And as they led Hrothgar and his warriors through the city, Arlen couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Back in the council chamber, Dr. Etha was already hard at work, adjusting the settings on a series of devices that looked like they'd been cobbled together from spare parts and wild dreams. Everything's ready, he announced as Arlen and the others returned. We just need to reroute the power from the black holes and keep our fingers crossed. And hope that the smell of burnt toast doesn't mean anything, Jorvik quipped, earning a chuckle from Brina. Dr. Etha grinned, clearly in his element. Exactly. Now, let's get this show on the road. As Arlen and the others watched, Dr. Etha began the delicate process of redirecting energy from the miniature black holes that powered the city. The room hummed with the sound of raw power being channeled, the lights flickering in time with the pulses of energy surging through the cables. How are we looking? Arlen asked, trying to suppress his mounting anxiety. Like a disaster waiting to happen, Brina replied, though her tone was more teasing than worried. Jorvik, watching the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and dread, chimed in. Let's just hope we don't end up in a different time ourselves. Dr. Etha made a few final tweaks, then stepped back, a satisfied smile on his face. There, the rift should stabilize any moment now. The council chamber was silent, save for the hum of machinery and the distant sounds of the city outside. Then, with a soft, almost anticlimactic asterisk pop asterisk, the flickering hologram of the time rift shifted, the chaotic swirl of energy smoothing into a more stable, controlled pattern. It's working, Doctor, Etha announced, his voice triumphant. The rift is stabilizing. Arlen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And the warriors, can we send them back? Should be able to, Dr. Etha confirmed, adjusting a few settings. We just need to set the coordinates and let the energy do the rest. Let's get to it then, Arlen said, his voice firm. If we can send Hrothgar and the others back without any more trouble, we might just avert a catastrophe. The process was surprisingly smooth, considering the stakes. As the machinery hummed and the lights flickered, Arlen and his team watched as the time-displaced warriors began to shimmer, their forms blurring and shifting as the energy of the rift enveloped them. Hrothgar stood at the front, his expression a mix of determination and acceptance. "If you speak true, then I will remember you as allies," he said, his voice booming over the noise. "And if this works," Arlen replied, "maybe we'll finally get some peace and quiet." With a final, resounding hum, the energy surged, and then one by one the warriors vanished, their figures dissolving into the air like morning mist. Silence fell over the council chamber, the hum of machinery fading into the background. Arlen, Brina, Jorvik, and Dr. Etha exchanged glances, a shared sense of relief and disbelief washing over them. "Did it work?" Jorvik asked, his voice tentative. Brina took a swig from her flask, then offered it to Arlen. "Here's hoping," she said with a wry smile. "If not, we've got a hell of a story for the history books." Arlen accepted the flask, taking a swig of the burning liquid. "Let's hope we don't have to find out the hard way." As the city settled into an uneasy calm, Arlen couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only bought themselves a temporary reprieve. The rift was still there, a reminder of the chaos they'd averted, and the chaos that could return at any moment. But for now, the city was safe, and that was enough. "Well, that was one hell of a day," Arlen said, handing the flask back to Brina. "And tomorrow will probably be worse," Brina replied, her tone dry as a desert. Arlen chuckled, shaking his head. "Probably, but at least we've got each other." Jorvik raised an eyebrow. "And Dr. Etha's questionable genius." Dr. Etha grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "Questionable? I'll take that as a compliment." As the stars twinkled overhead, the city of Umbra Nexus seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief mingling with the cool night air. The rift was stable, the warriors were gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed a little less bleak, even if that future still smelled faintly of burnt toast. The city of Umbra Nexus, a cosmic mistake on a rock with no air, looked like it was one good shove from toppling into chaos. The streets, typically a hum of neon lights and disgruntled citizens mumbling about their latest existential crisis, were now a cacophony of chaos and despair. Power outages were spreading like a particularly aggressive rash, and the citizens, already a bit cranky from living in a city powered by miniature black holes, were reaching new levels of hysteria. Arlen Vex, headache throbbing like a drum solo at a death metal concert, stood in the council chamber, which was still permeated with the lovely scent of burnt toast, because who doesn't love the smell of impending doom? He surveyed the scene before him, a council that looked more like an angry mob. In front of him was an assortment of disgruntled council members who seemed to have forgotten that teamwork makes the dream work, or, at least prevents the city from imploding. "Can we even trust you to keep the lights on, Vex?" spat Councillor Dawkins, a man with the charisma of a block of cheese. "The Norsemen were a problem, but now we can't even operate a toaster without everything blowing up." Arlen rubbed his temples, wondering if he'd left his sense of humor in his other pants. "Well, Dawkins, considering your dedication to high drama, I'm surprised you're not enjoying the blackout. Adds quite the apocalyptic ambience, don't you think?" Dawkins scowled, a talent he'd refined to an art form. "I'm serious, Vex. We need solutions, not sarcasm." "Solutions, right?" Arlen mused, glancing over at the hologram displaying the time rift, a swirling reminder that the universe tended to have the last laugh. "Maybe we can just blame everything on Hrothgar. He's not here to defend himself, after all." Brina, lounging with her usual grace and a flask that had seen better days, chimed in. "Or we could blame Dr. Etha. I'm sure whatever contraption he's cooked up is at least partially responsible." Dr. Etha, standing at a console that looked like the love child of a junkyard and a mad scientist's fever dream, flashed a grin. "Oh, I'm always up for being the scapegoat." Makes me feel important. Jorvik, who had been pacing like a caged tiger on a caffeine binge, stopped long enough to voice the question on everyone's mind. What exactly are we going to do about the time rift, the blackouts, the fact that our cities held together with hopes and duct tape? Arlen sighed, wishing he could magic the stress away. Doctor. Etha has a plan to stabilize the rift by rerouting more energy from the black hole generators. Rerouting energy from black hole generators, Dawkins interrupted, his voice dripping with skepticism. What could possibly go wrong? Well, Arlen replied, eyes narrowing in mock contemplation. If we're lucky, nothing. If we're not, well, Umbra Nexus will become a delightful case study for future physicists. Doctor. Etha, ever the enthusiast for potentially catastrophic plans, nodded eagerly. It's all very simple. We channel the energy more efficiently, stabilize the rift, and voila! No more time-traveling Vikings, or at least fewer of them. Brina snorted. Efficient, like when we try to fix the sewage system by turning it into a tourist attraction. Jorvik massaged his temples, looking like he was trying to physically shove the frustration out of his skull. We're missing the point. We need to focus on getting the city running again before there's a full-scale panic. Arlen, torn between laughter and despair, gestured to the hologram. We fix the rift, the power stabilizes, and hopefully we don't end up on the wrong side of a cosmic joke. Doctor, Etha, can you get it done? Doctor. Etha tapped his chin thoughtfully. Of course, but as always there's a risk. What's a little risk among friends? Jorvik muttered, earning a dry chuckle from Brina. Dawkins, never one to let a good crisis go to waste, leaned in. And if it fails? Then I suggest you invest in candles and canned goods, Arlen replied, his patience wearing thinner than a politician's promise. Or maybe a vacation on one of those planets that aren't teetering on the edge of a quantum catastrophe. With the plan, or something resembling a plan, in place, the council dispersed, leaving Arlen and his motley crew to sort out the details. The city outside was a mess of flickering lights and anxious murmurs, and as the group made their way to Dr. Etha's lab, Arlen couldn't shake the feeling that they were just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Except, in space, with black holes and time rifts instead of icebergs. Dr. Etha's lab was a testament to the idea that genius and madness often shared a very thin line. Machinery hummed and whirred in a symphony of barely controlled chaos, and the room was lit by the gentle glow of a dozen screens displaying equations that looked like they'd been conceived during a fever dream. Right, Doctor, Etha said, clapping his hands together with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed high-stakes tinkering. Let's get this underway, shall we? Brina, ever the voice of pragmatic pessimism, took a swig from her flask and offered it to Arlen. Here's to hoping we don't end up turning the city into a very large, very public barbecue. Arlen accepted the flask, feeling the burn of the liquid chase away at least a fraction of his anxiety. Barbecue or not, we've got to try. Jorvik, standing by one of the consoles, peered at the screens with a frown. Are you sure you know what you're doing, Doctor? Etha grinned, his expression a mix of mischief and determination. Of course not. But that's never stopped me before. The process began with a series of increasingly complex button presses and lever pulls, the machinery responding with a chorus of clanks and hisses. The lights flickered ominously, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls like specters of doubt. Arlen watched the proceedings with a sense of impending dread. How long is this going to take, Doctor? Etha, adjusting a particularly stubborn dial, replied, Oh, not long. Just long enough for us to question our life choices. As the energy began to reroute, the hologram of the time rift flickered and fizzed, the chaotic swirl of energy slowly shifting into something resembling stability. Arlen dared to hope, just for a moment, that they might actually pull it off. Then the power surged and the entire lab was plunged into darkness, the machinery falling silent with a final, defiant whir. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of everyone's collective breath, held in a moment of tense anticipation. Well, Brina said, breaking the silence with her usual dry wit. That can't be good, Doctor. Etha, undeterred by the setback, began fiddling with the controls in the dim light. A minor hiccup, I'm sure, just a little adjustment needed. Jorvik, squinting at the darkened screens, muttered, minor hiccup, feels more like a major heart attack. As Dr. Etha worked to restore power, Arlen's mind raced with the implications of their failure. The city was on the brink, and if they couldn't stabilize the rift, the resulting chaos could tear them apart. The lights flickered back on, revealing Dr. Etha's triumphant expression. There we go, just needed a little kickstart. The relief was palpable, but Arlen couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a precipice, a single misstep away from disaster. The time rift still loomed large, a reminder of the chaos that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. As the machinery resumed its rhythmic hum, Arlen turned to his companions, a resolute determination in his eyes. Let's get this done, then. We've come too far to turn back now, Doctor. Etha nodded, his fingers flying over the controls with a practiced ease. Agreed. Just a few more adjustments and we'll have this thing under control. Brina, leaning against a console with her usual nonchalance, watched the proceedings with a mixture of skepticism and amusement. And if it doesn't work, Arlen shrugged, a wry smile playing at the corners of his lips, then I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Or, rebuild it after it collapses. Jorvik, ever the realist, added, let's just hope there are enough pieces left to rebuild if it comes to that. With the final adjustments in place, Dr. Etha stepped back, his expression one of cautious optimism. That should do it. Now we just wait and see. The council members, who had been watching the experiment with a mix of hope and skepticism, exchanged glances. Arlen met their gazes with a steely resolve, his own uncertainty masked by a veneer of confidence. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the lab was almost palpable. The hologram of the time rift flickered and shifted, the chaotic swirl of energy slowly settling into a more stable pattern. Arlen held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for the final verdict. The room was silent, save for the hum of machinery and the distant murmur of the city outside. Finally, Dr. Etha let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's working. The rift is stabilizing. The relief that washed over the group was almost tangible, a collective exhale of tension that had been building for far too long. Arlen allowed himself a small smile, the weight on his shoulders lifting just a fraction. Looks like we did it, he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Brina raised her flask in a mock toast. To improbable victories and even more improbable plans. Jorvik, ever the cautious optimist, added, and to hoping we don't have to do that again anytime soon. As the city began to settle into a tenuous calm, Arlen couldn't shake the feeling that they'd merely bought themselves a temporary reprieve. The rift was stable, but the chaos that had threatened to tear them apart still lingered, a reminder of the fragility of their existence. But for now, the city was safe, and that was enough. Arlen allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. We'll deal with tomorrow when it comes, he said, echoing Brina's earlier sentiment. For now, let's just enjoy the peace while it lasts. Dr. Etha, ever the optimist, grinned. And who knows, maybe next time we'll even manage to avoid the whole end-of-the-world thing. As the stars twinkled overhead, the city of Umbra Nexus seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief mingling with the cool night air. The rift was stable, the chaos was contained, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the future seemed a little less bleak, even if that future still smelled faintly of burnt toast. Arlen Vex leaned back in his chair, staring at the hologram displaying the time rift as if sheer willpower could stabilize the damn thing. His fingers itched for Brina's flask, anything to burn away the dread settling in his gut. The city was holding together by sheer space tape and good intentions, and he had a distinct feeling that both were running out. Outside, Umbra Nexus was a symphony of flickering neon lights and the distant hum of uneasy citizens. The power outages were as common as a bureaucrat's excuse and equally infuriating. If they didn't get things sorted soon, they'd have a rebellion on their hands, led by the Norse followers who were one black hole mishap away from offering sacrifices to Odin. "Look at them," Jorvik said, nodding toward the hologram of the time rift. "Like moths to a flame, except the flame is a time anomaly and the moths are armed to the teeth." Arlen smirked. "And if we don't sort this out, we'll be the ones getting burned." Dr. Quill and Etha, tinkering with a device that looked suspiciously like a repurposed toaster, seemed entirely too cheerful for a man playing with the fabric of reality. "Not to worry, gentlemen, I have a plan." Brina rolled her eyes, taking a generous swig from her flask. "Great. Another one of those plans. Last time you had a plan, we nearly ended up as space debris." "Not the time for pessimism, Brina," Arlen said. "We're in enough shit without adding to it." Jorvik sighed, scratching his head. "Okay, genius, what's this plan of yours?" Dr. Etha straightened, a gleam in his eye that suggested equal parts genius and lunacy. "We harness the power of the warrior artifacts, interface them with our black hole technology, and use that energy to stabilize the rift." Silence greeted him like an old friend. Brina broke it with a snort. "So, let me get this straight. You want to mix ancient warrior artifacts with cutting-edge black hole tech and hope it doesn't blow us to bits." "Exactly, Doctor." Etha beamed, as if he just suggested a picnic in the park. Arlen rubbed his temples. "And how exactly are we going to convince a bunch of time-displaced warriors to lend us their swords and shields for your little science experiment?" "As luck would have it, Doctor," Etha said, "there's a group of warriors who seem a tad more reasonable than the axe-wielding maniacs currently trying to redecorate Main Street with our entrails." "The Satori of the Dawn," Jorvik said, nodding slowly. "Heard they don't like Hrothgar much. Guess the enemy of my enemy is my temporary ally." Arlen grinned despite himself. "Sounds like a plan destined for success or catastrophic failure." "One of those." With the Council's reluctant blessing, they headed out to find the Satori warriors, leaving Dawkins behind to keep the metaphorical fires from spreading too far. Not that Arlen trusted him to do much more than fan the flames. The streets were a patchwork of chaos, makeshift barricades, citizens arguing, and the occasional Viking enthusiast trying to communicate by way of axe. All in all, just another average day in Umbra Nexus. They reached the Satori camp, a surprisingly orderly collection of tents and warriors who didn't immediately try to skewer them. Satori himself was a tall, imposing figure with a beard that suggested either great wisdom or a general disdain for razors. "Arlen Vex," Satori said, his voice a deep rumble. "What brings you to our humble camp?" Arlen bowed slightly, hoping to convey respect rather than desperation. "We come seeking your help to stabilize the time rift. Your warrior's artifacts could be key." Satori raised an eyebrow, a feat that immediately made Arlen envious. "You wish to use our relics in your experiments?" "To save the city," Jorvik added quickly. "And maybe all of us from becoming footnotes in a cosmic history book." The warrior leader considered this, stroking his beard as though divining answers from its depths. "And what assurance do we have that this plan will not lead to our destruction?" Brina, never one to miss an opportunity for a quip, interjected. "Well, no one's died in the lab yet, if that's any comfort." Arlen shot her a glare but couldn't resist a smile. "We know it's a risk, but it's our best shot. Without your help, we might as well start practicing our post-apocalyptic survival skills." Satori nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Very well, we will assist you, but know this, if your plan fails, the wrath of my people will not be gentle." "Wouldn't dream of it," Arlen said, relieved. "Let's get this circus on the road." With the Satori of the Dawn on their side, Arlen felt a glimmer of hope as they returned to the lab. Well, hope laced with the usual dose of impending doom, but beggars couldn't be choosers. Dr. Etha welcomed them back with the enthusiasm of a child at a toy store. "Ah, excellent. You've returned with the artifacts. Let's get them integrated. The lab was a chaotic mess of wires, screens, and what looked like a kitchen blender repurposed for who knew what. Arlen hoped it wasn't meant to be vital because he had a distinct feeling Etha wouldn't handle the culinary disappointment well. As the Satori warriors handed over their artifacts, swords, shields, and more than a few objects Arlen couldn't identify, Dr. Etha got to work, connecting them to the black hole tech with a manic glee that spoke of either mad genius or impending disaster, probably both. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Jorvik asked, watching the flickering screens with a mix of skepticism and dread. Doctor, Etha didn't even look up. "Of course not, but it will be spectacular." Arlen took a deep breath. "Spectacular failure or success, both if we're lucky," Etha replied, adjusting a series of dials with the care of a man defusing a bomb. "Now let's flip the switch and see what happens." "That's comforting," Brina muttered, taking a swig from her flask. "Remind me why we let him do this again." "Because his idea is the best bad idea we have," Arlen said, watching as the machinery began to hum with life. The room filled with the sound of energy coursing through the contraption, the lights flickering in time with the beating of his heart. The hologram of the time rift shimmered, the chaotic swirl of energy beginning to stabilize, if only slightly. "Here goes nothing," Arlen said, his voice barely audible over the noise. The machines roared to life, the artifacts glowing with a strange, ethereal light as they interfaced with the black hole technology. The room vibrated with energy, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and hope, and maybe just a hint of spaghetti bolognese. That last part was probably Brina's fault. As the energy surged, the hologram of the time rift flickered, the chaotic swirl of energy shifting into a more stable pattern. Arlen held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and then with a final, defiant whir, the room was plunged into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the universe to decide what came next. "Doctor." Etha blinked, a look of astonishment on his face. "Well, that wasn't supposed to happen." "What do you mean?" Arlen asked, his voice strained. Dr. Etha scratched his head. "I mean, it worked." The relief was a tangible thing, washing over them like a wave. Arlen let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Brina raised her flask in a toast. "To not blowing ourselves up. This time, at least." The rest of the council members joined in, their laughter a mix of relief and disbelief. Even Satori managed a small smile, his warriors nodding in approval. Jorvik, ever the realist, added, "Let's hope we don't have to do that again anytime soon." As they stood there, the room filled with the quiet hum of machinery and the distant murmur of a city slowly coming back to life, Arlen couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They'd done the impossible, at least for now. But as the stars twinkled outside, he knew that the peace they'd achieved was fragile, a temporary reprieve in a universe that seemed determined to unmake them. The rift was stable, but the threat still lingered, a shadow on the edge of existence. For now, though, it was enough. They'd faced the chaos and come out the other side, and as Arlen looked at his companions, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. "Let's get some rest," he said, his voice carrying a note of determination. "We'll deal with whatever the universe throws at us tomorrow, Doctor." Etha, ever the optimist, grinned. "And who knows? Maybe next time we'll even manage to avoid the whole end-of-the-world thing." As they left the lab, the city of Umbra Nexus seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief mingling with the cool night air. The rift was stable, the chaos was contained, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the future seemed a little less bleak, even if that future still smelled faintly of burnt toast. "Do you think the rift will hold?" Jorvik asked as they walked through the dimly lit corridors. Arlen shrugged, a wry smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Who knows? For now, let's just enjoy the peace while it lasts." Brina, ever the pragmatist, nodded. "And stock up on more canned goods, just in case." With a chuckle, Arlen couldn't help but agree. Yeah, just in case. And as they made their way through the city, the stars still twinkling overhead, he dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could pull off the impossible just a little longer. The lab buzzed with a kind of hysteria that you only see when mad scientists and desperate warriors team up to save the universe. Dr. Etha adjusted his glasses, which were more for dramatic effect than corrective vision. This is it, folks. Either we stabilize this rift and stop time-displaced Vikings from turning the city into a reenactment of their favorite battle scenes, or we get to enjoy front-row seats to the end of reality. Who's in? Arlen nodded, trying to mask the creeping dread with a grim smile. Just another day in paradise, right? Brina, flask ever at the ready, offered a toast without waiting for anyone else to join. To the end of days, or just another Tuesday in Umbra Nexus, whichever comes first. Satori's warriors, their relics now wired into a hodgepodge of black hole tech and kitchen appliances, stood ready. If this fails, Satori rumbled, your ghosts will have company in Valhalla. Comforting thought, Jorvik mumbled. Nothing says team spirit like threats of eternal haunting. Doctor. Etha, oblivious to the tension, or maybe thriving on it, clapped his hands. Right. Let's fire up this cosmic monstrosity and cross our fingers. The machine began to hum, a deep, mechanical purr that resonated in Arlen's chest like an impending heart attack. The hologram of the time rift flickered to life, its chaotic energy swirling with a malevolent grace only an engineer could love. Okay, everyone, Etha shouted over the din. Time to see if our ancestors were into lending a hand with world-ending crises. As if on cue, the time rift pulsed with a new intensity, a swirling mass of potential disasters compacted into one convenient location. It was enough to make anyone reconsider their career choices. Can't say I signed up for this, Jorvik said, his eyes glued to the swirling chaos. Maybe we should have just stuck with community theater. No turning back now, Arlen replied, though he couldn't help but wish they'd opted for a less cataclysmic hobby. The artifacts glowed with an eerie light, channeling their ancient power through the conduits of Etha's contraption. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment it looked like everything just might fall apart. But then, as if by a miracle or a particularly effective coincidence, the rift began to stabilize. The swirling chaos slowed, the edges of the breach smoothing out into something almost serene. I'll be damned, Brina said, her voice filled with genuine surprise. It's actually working, Doctor. Etha whooped like a madman, which wasn't that far off. I told you. Mad science saves the day again. For a moment, it seemed like everything was going to be all right. But of course, fate had a twisted sense of humor. Because just as they were about to celebrate, Hrothgar and his merry band of Norse enthusiasts decided to crash the party. The door slammed open, and in strode Hrothgar, beard bristling and eyes alight with the kind of fervor usually reserved for religious zealots or people on reality TV. What devilry is this? He bellowed. Satori stepped forward, meeting Hrothgar's gaze with the calm authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be intimidating. It's the kind of devilry that saves lives. Hrothgar sneered, clearly unimpressed by the whole saving lives spiel. This is an affront to the gods. You toy with forces beyond your understanding. Oh, we understand them all right, Brina quipped, taking another swig. We just don't care. Arlen sighed, stepping up beside Satori. Look, Hrothgar, we get it. You want to honor your gods, but how about we all try to live long enough to tell the tale at the mead hall? Hrothgar's eyes narrowed, suspicion written in every line of his face. And what of the rift, this abomination, Doctor? Etha, ever the optimist, gestured at the stabilized hologram. See for yourself. We've tamed the beast. Hrothgar studied the image, and while understanding dawned slowly, it was enough to give Arlen hope. And you, Arlen Vex, what do you propose? We stay in this time of metal and smoke. Or return, Arlen offered, to the days you know. We've got a choice now. Thanks to some good old-fashioned technological meddling. Hrothgar considered this, stroking his beard with the kind of exaggerated thoughtfulness that could only mean one of two things. He was either going to agree or cut them all down where they stood. And my followers, they make the choice for themselves, Satori interjected, a steely edge to his voice. That's what true leaders do. Arlen braced himself for the worst, but slowly Hrothgar nodded. Very well, let it be known that even the fiercest of wolves can find peace when the hunt is done. Or when the prey turns out to have bigger teeth, Brina added with a smirk. Hrothgar chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling downhill. Perhaps you are right. The choice given, Hrothgar's followers began to deliberate. Some seemed eager to return to a time they understood, while others, curious about the world of neon lights and endless possibilities, decided to stay. Looks like we've got ourselves a little time-traveling diaspora, Jorvik said, watching the proceedings with a bemused expression. It's a chance, Arlen replied, feeling the weight of what they'd accomplished. A chance for something new, as the warriors made their choices, Doctor. Etha busied himself with the final preparations. All right, people, let's wrap this up before the universe changes its mind. The machine roared to life once more, the air filled with the sound of time bending to their will. One by one, those who chose to return stepped forward, and with a flash of light, vanished back to their own era. Well, that's that, Brina said, her voice carrying a note of finality. Guess we did save the world after all. Arlen couldn't help but smile. For now, at least. With the rift stable and the warriors either returned or integrated into their new lives, the threat that had loomed over Umbra Nexus was finally resolved, at least until the next existential crisis rolled around. Doctor, Etha, ever the optimist, clapped Arlen on the back. And to think there were people who doubted our methods. That's because your methods involve high explosives and theoretical physics, Jorvik pointed out. Not exactly a recipe for confidence. Details, Etha replied with a dismissive wave. The important thing is that it worked. As they left the lab, the city seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The power flickered back to life, the neon lights casting their garish glow over streets that, for the first time in a long time, weren't filled with chaos. The stars above, indifferent as ever, twinkled in the night sky. Arlen looked up, feeling a strange sense of peace. So, what's next? Brina shrugged, already planning her next drink. We wait for the next disaster and hope it's not as world-ending as this one. That's the spirit, Jorvik said with a grin. Always look on the bright side, right? Arlen laughed, a sound that felt good in the aftermath of so much tension. Right. Here's to another day in Umbra Nexus. May it be slightly less terrible than the last. As the makeshift team of misfits and mad scientists walked through the city, Arlen couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They'd faced chaos, defied the odds, and come out the other side, if not unscathed, then at least intact. And for Umbra Nexus, that was about as close to a victory as you could get. Think we'll have some peace now? Jorvik asked, a hopeful note in his voice. Arlen smirked, shaking his head. Not a chance, but we'll be ready for whatever comes next. Brina, flask raised in a perpetual toast, nodded in agreement. Here's to the future. May it be slightly less catastrophic. With that, they walked on, ready to face whatever the universe decided to throw their way next. Because if there was one thing they'd learned, it was that in a world of chaos and uncertainty, the only thing you could count on was each other, and maybe the occasional miracle from a mad scientist with a penchant for cosmic disasters. As they disappeared into the city, the shadows of Umbra Nexus watched over them, waiting patiently for the next chapter to unfold. But for now, at least, the world was safe. And in a place like this, that was something worth celebrating. The neon glow of Umbra Nexus flickered uncertainly as Arlen Vex leaned against a rusting railing, watching the city gradually piece itself back together like a drunk stumbling into sobriety. The chaos had receded like a bad hangover, leaving behind the kind of quiet that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. It was like the universe had hit a cosmic pause button, giving everyone a moment to catch their breath, or choke on it, depending on their luck. It hadn't been that long since the time rift had threatened to turn their slice of rock into an interdimensional tourist trap for time-displaced warriors. Now the streets were calm, or as calm as they ever got in a place powered by miniature black holes and the collective insanity of its inhabitants. Brina sidled up next to Arlen, flask in hand because she was nothing if not consistent. "Penny for your thoughts, Vex. Though with inflation, I'll settle for a drink." Arlen raised an eyebrow, remembering the whirlwind of chaos they just survived. "Just thinking how we somehow managed to not blow ourselves up. It's almost disappointing," she snorted, taking a swig from her ever-present flask. "Don't tempt fate. You'll have the gods or the council, which is worse, conspiring against us again. Tell me about it. Counselor Dawkins is going to have a field day with this. Probably try to legislate gravity out of existence next." Jorvik appeared on Arlen's other side, nodding at the city below. "It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, only the train's filled with radioactive clowns." Arlen smirked. "And we're the lucky bastards holding the train tickets." As if conjured by their conversation, Counselor Dawkins' voice floated over, nasal and irritating like a mosquito that had become sentient with a vendetta. "Vex, a word." "Great," Arlen muttered under his breath. "Just what I needed, more bureaucratic nonsense." Jorvik clapped him on the shoulder. "Go on, take one for the team." "I'll have Brina save you a drink." "Save two," Arlen said, squaring his shoulders and heading over to where Dawkins stood, a man who looked like he'd been born with a scowl permanently etched onto his face. "Counselor," Arlen greeted, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone facing a root canal. Dawkins sniffed, adjusting his cufflinks like they were plotting against him. "I assume you have an explanation for the recent disturbances." "Sure," Arlen replied. "We fixed the time rift, saved the city from becoming a Viking theme park, and didn't even charge extra. You're welcome." Dawkins frowned, his expression suggesting he'd rather be wrestling a giant squid. "And the Norsemen, they've integrated into our society," Arlen shrugged. "Some chose to stay, some went back. Cultural exchange and all that." "Who knew Vikings would be so adaptable?" the counselor sighed, a sound like air escaping a balloon. "Ensure this doesn't happen again, Vex. The last thing we need is another crisis." "Of course," Arlen said, doing his best not to roll his eyes. "I'll just add prevent all future catastrophes to my to-do list." Dawkins nodded as if he'd just imparted divine wisdom before turning on his heel and marching off, likely to argue with his reflection or demand a recount of the pebbles in his shoes. Arlen watched him go, shaking his head. What a charmer! Returning to Brina and Jorvik, he let out a long breath. "Well, that was fun." "Fun as getting a tooth pulled," Jorvik agreed. With the bureaucratic nonsense momentarily at bay, Arlen could finally take stock of their handiwork. The streets of Umbra Nexus, though scarred and battered, were alive with a patchwork of cultures and technologies. Hrothgar and his remaining warriors had taken to the new world with a kind of cheerful barbarism, turning their skills to more constructive endeavors. As it turned out, blacksmithing skills translated well to infrastructure repair. Brina sipped her drink thoughtfully. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day where we'd have Vikings repairing our space toilets." Jorvik laughed. "The past and future colliding in the most ridiculous way possible." Arlen nodded, feeling a strange sense of pride. "We did it. We saved the city and didn't even need a miracle. More like a series of improbable accidents," Brina corrected. "Same difference," Arlen grinned. Across the street, Satori was overseeing the cleanup, his warriors still bristling with enough weaponry to start a small war, albeit a very organized one. Despite the chaos, they'd proven themselves allies, willing to lay down their lives, or at least a few limbs, for the cause. Arlen wandered over to where Satori was directing traffic like a particularly stern schoolteacher. Satori got a moment. The leader turned, his expression as stoic as always. "Vex, what is it?" Arlen scratched the back of his neck. "Just wanted to say thanks. Couldn't have done it without your help or your terrifying arsenal." Satori allowed himself a rare smile, a fleeting thing like the sun breaking through clouds. It was our fight, too. Besides, it's not every day you get to save the universe. Twice if you're lucky, Arlen chuckled. Lucky isn't the word I'd use. Then what would you call it? Satori asked, his gaze sharp and curious. Survival, Arlen said with a shrug, and maybe a hint of insanity. As they surveyed the city, a sense of camaraderie hung in the air, a bond forged in the fires of shared adversity. It was something that even Hrothgar, who had initially seemed ready to flay them all alive, could appreciate. The bearded warrior had taken to his new role with the kind of enthusiasm that was both terrifying and strangely heartwarming. Hrothgar, noticing Arlen's gaze, raised an eyebrow. What? Expecting me to sprout wings and fly? Wouldn't be the weirdest thing that's happened this week, Arlen replied. Hrothgar laughed, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. Glad to see you haven't lost your sense of humor, Vex. Can't afford to. Not in this place. The warriors, scattered throughout the city, were proving themselves invaluable in ways no one had anticipated. Their skills, honed over centuries of conflict, were surprisingly adaptable to the challenges of futuristic life. They'd taken to the neural translators with remarkable ease, though there was still the occasional hiccup involving mistranslated idioms and some very confused pigeons. Brina sidled up next to Arlen again, her flask now miraculously refilled. What's the plan now, fearless leader? Arlen shrugged. Keep the peace, patch up the holes, and try not to die. The usual. Sounds like a vacation, she said with a wink. Jorvik appeared again, munching on what appeared to be a very out-of-place apple. You know, I think chaos suits us. We seem to thrive in it. Arlen couldn't help but agree. As much as he'd grumbled and cursed his way through the ordeal, there was a part of him that was strangely at home amidst the madness. Maybe it was the sense of purpose, the challenge of it all, or maybe he was just as crazy as Dr. Etha, who was currently working on some new contraption that involved far too many blinking lights and a questionable amount of duct tape. The city, for all its flaws and eccentricities, was beginning to feel like home, and that, Arlen realized, was something worth fighting for. As the day turned into night, the streets of Umbra Nexus came alive with the hum of recovery. The neon lights flickered back to life, casting their garish glow over the patchwork wonderland. People moved through the streets, a mix of old and new, past and future, bound together by the peculiar bond of shared survival. Arlen stood at the edge of the city, watching it all unfold. He knew there would be challenges ahead, crises that would test their resolve and stretch the limits of their ingenuity. But for now, at least, they had a moment of peace, or as close to peace as you could get in a city built on chaos. Dr. Etha wandered over, looking far too pleased with himself for someone who had just narrowly avoided obliterating reality. Quite the sight, isn't it? Arlen nodded. Yeah, we did good. Etha adjusted his glasses, squinting at the stars above. Think they'll write songs about us? If they do, Arlen replied, I hope they leave out the part where we almost killed everyone with our own stupidity. What's a good story without a little danger? Etha grinned, the kind of grin that suggested he was already planning his next reckless experiment. Brina, never far from a bottle or a laugh, joined them. Here's to the next disaster, she said, raising her flask in a toast. And to the idiots who save us from it, Arlen added, clinking his imaginary glass against hers. As they stood together, watching the lights of Umbra Nexus twinkle in the dark, Arlen felt a sense of contentment. It was a rare thing, fleeting and fragile but precious all the same. They'd survived the chaos, faced down the odds, and come out the other side, battered, bruised, but unbowed. And in a universe where everything could change in an instant, that was a victory worth savoring. So, what's next? Jorvik asked, ever the pragmatist. Arlen considered the question for a moment, then shrugged. Same as always. We keep on fighting, keep on surviving. Brina nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the first hint of dawn was creeping in. Here's to another day in paradise. And with that, they turned back to the city, ready to face whatever trials the universe decided to throw their way next. because in a place like Umbra Nexus, the only certainty was uncertainty itself. And that, Arlen thought with a smile, was what made it all worthwhile.